Hello, I'm Robert Royal. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Catholic Thing, a daily column series. And these are the Catholic Thing podcasts, which we are bringing to you under the auspices of the title, also The Vatican Thing. Now, I have to explain that last week when we did this podcast, we thought we were finished with the Vatican Thing because the Synod on Synodality was done. But I'm joined again this week by my longtime colleague and friend, pastor in the Archdiocese of New York and a canon lawyer, Father Gerald Murray. Father, we thought we thought we were out, but they keep pulling us back in, as they say in The Godfather. Two things happened in the past week. We thought that the Synod was over last Sunday with the final Mass, and clearly, Pope Francis and his helpers in the Vatican had already prepared two things that have appeared in this past week. One was a document, a motu proprio, about how theology ought to be done going forward. And it's actually a recommendation for the statutes of the Pontifical Academy of Theology. And in it, he says there needs to be a paradigm shift, that theology needs to be contextual, that it has to begin sort of from the bottom up, and it has to respond to real problems of people in the world. And the second thing that happened, just to make sure that we have these in our minds as we started out, is we're starting to hear rumors that he is considering a change in the ways that the next pope and future popes would be elected. Now, there have been some recent denials, as you also know, of course, but these are two very large shifts. One on the intellectual level, about how theology is going to be done, and another on the institutional level on how even the choice of the next pope or future popes is going to take place. So these are two momentous questions. We're recording on Monday, November 7th, November 6th. And this is going to appear on November 7th. And there will be at the Catholic Thing today, November 7, 3 essays by 3 distinguished theologians, Larry Chapp, Eduardo Echeverria, and Father Thomas Weinandy, on that question of how to promote and have this paradigm shift in theology. So I don't want to spend a lot of time with that, Father, but I think our hearers and our listeners our listeners and our viewers are probably going to want to just get some quick take on what does this mean, this paradigm shift into a contextual theology?
That's a great question, and it's sort of like the Synod. We'll only find out what synodality means once we get into it. And I think the contextualization of theology, properly understood, means that the Church studies and responds to questions that concern the faith, the nature of philosophy as it affects the faith, much as St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas did, respond to the world around us and what's going on. In the modern context, though, paradigm shift and contextualization usually means the reference point is no longer Catholic doctrine. It's what people are saying, thinking, and doing on the street, so to speak, right now. So that's my great fear. And I have to say, in that document, the Pope also said he doesn't want a desk theology. He wants a practical and responsive theology. There's no other way to do theology than sit at a desk and with pen and paper, now computer screen, write out your thoughts. So I'm very suspicious when I hear that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I think you're right to emphasize that in a way, it's not a new theology to say that we need to look at what's actually going on in the world, because that's happened since ancient Roman times. The theologians have looked at what's going on in the world and tried to respond to it and tried to think it through. But to me, it just seems that this is more of that very familiar confusion and ambiguity that we're used to in this papacy, where the Holy Father seems to be saying something that's traditional on the one hand, as we're saying. And on the other hand, this emphasis on experience, we've seen at many points in his papacy that he almost kind of disdains formal theology, that he wants some kind of practical application, that the church is a field hospital. But as I've said and others have said, and I think the Vatican has actually changed its tune a little bit on this, you can't very well be a hospital without a knowledge of medicine. And you can't have a knowledge of medicine without having researchers who are in labs and are doing things at desks that seem to be very abstract and very distant from the patients. But it's precisely those people who are digging into and finding answers, which at a superficial, immediate level, I mean, you can have a good bedside manner and hold someone's hand as they're ill, but people who are ill want to be healed. And so I think that the thing that is perhaps being somewhat hidden away here is that we really need both. We need to confront what is going on right now, and let's face it, what's going on right now is novel and is quite challenging. But we also need that traditional logos, that rational probing into the nature of God and the nature of human life.
Yeah, very much agree,
Well,
Bob.
yeah, yeah. Well, we'll hear more about this, and I encourage everyone who is listening or watching this to go to the Catholic Thing website, www.thecatholicthing.org today. We have three very distinguished theologians who are cutting into this subject matter, and I think making some very interesting points that no doubt we'll be coming back to over the coming months, because I think that this is orienting the year preparation for next October's Synod on Synodality. This is one of the ways that theology is going to be reshaped, I think, for that event as well. Father, let's turn, though, to another very large subject, and that is this rumor that we've been hearing that seemed to be confirmed by a number of very, very credible, experienced news sites. The Pillar, some of the people like Diane Montagna, who are friends of both of ours, people who have actually spoken with some high up figures in the Vatican and claim that there is a study underway of how the election of the next or future popes can be made more synodal, which seems to imply that there might be 25% of the general congregations, the discussions before the actual conclave, or perhaps even the participation of 25% of non-cardinal participants, priests, bishops, but also possibly laymen and women. What are you hearing, and where do you think that this is headed?
Yes, last week I had heard that this was being discussed in Rome and was not well known by some. But then this hit the presses on Saturday night. Two outlets independently confirming that there is a discussion going on according to their sources. You got to remember at the Synod, Bob, the Pope said what we're doing here is supposed to be a model for the rest of the church. In other words, dioceses, parishes, presumably religious orders, but also institutions of the Roman Curia would seem to fall into that. So the College of Cardinals, a venerable institution, which has guaranteed over the last 1,000 years a relative independence from outside influences on papal elections. Now this is suddenly being cast as something that needs to be made synodal by the presence of non-cardinals. This is a revolution, and on the canonical
Yeah,
level, it's a big thing. But go ahead.
yeah. I was going to ask you. Yeah, I think we ought to break this into two parts. Let's start with the canonical level. I mean, you're a canon lawyer, so you know what the legal implications are. What changes would have to occur institutionally, even to make this possible?
Well, let's say, for instance, if the Pope were to make lay people cardinals or women and men religious, he'd have to change the code of canon law, which stipulates that only priests can be made cardinals, and that once a priest is made a cardinal, he should be ordained as a bishop. Now, the other institution, the conclave, is regulated by a separate law from the Code of Canon Law, and in it, only cardinals are permitted to be present and vote. So let's say the Pope were to say, well, I'm not going to make these 25% into cardinals, I'm simply going to add them in to be voters at the conclave. That's a possible scenario, according to the rumors. Well, then you'd have to say, well, the College of Cardinals is no longer the institution that elects the Pope. It's an amalgamation of cardinals and non-cardinals, similar to what the Synod of Bishops was. And as you and I discussed, I don't think you can honestly call it a Synod of Bishops anymore. So on the canonical level, you have a lot of disjointedness. And the presumption in the law, of course, reflects the reality that the shepherds of the church, the cardinals, who are these bishops who historically were connected to the Diocese of Rome, to the Holy See, they knew how to put things together to try and get a good pope. Now it's going to be a series of people that the pope who had just died had previously nominated, and they show up. What is their knowledge? What is their responsibility? Uh, Very serious questions on the canonical level.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, we already saw in the synod that there are people who seem to like this kind of format. They, generally speaking, are not the bishops and the cardinals. They seem to be the lay people who are happy for the first time to be included. But what that is going to cash out to, practically speaking, even in terms of the synod, is very hard to predict. So I'm going to ask you an impossible question. What is likely to happen? Let's say that the most ambitious change takes place, and we do have not only 25% of people maybe discussing who the future pope ought to be in those general congregations, but actually, we don't even know if they would go into some sort of closed session in the Sistine Chapel the way they traditionally have, which was a carefully guarded secret precisely for the reason that you say, because we wanted to make sure there was no politicking insofar as that can be done even with inside the church, but to keep it relatively isolated from cultural pressures, economic pressures, and political pressures of whatever kind. What would you expect might be likely to happen if lay people, uh, lay people without necessarily any special theological training, are now going to be included inside the actual room where the next pope is elected?
Well, this is the major import here, Bob. This is a revolution, and I think it will make the church appear to the world, the secular world, and then to the Catholics in the world, that everything's up for grabs. If there's one thing that the whole world knows about, it's the white smoke and the cardinals entering into the conclave. They're shut up in the Sistine Chapel. They can't come out until the Pope's elect. Everybody knows this, and it's viewed as something sacred, even beyond the church. If now the Pope, before he dies, puts out a list of, I don't know, 20, 30, 40 people who are now going to be voting, those names, unless they're kept secret, will be known. And then, of course, there's going to be lobbying them. And of course, the other thing is, what will be the criterion of selection? Will it be regional? Will it be half male, half female? Do people have to be practicing Catholics, or will they be people who we don't even know what they're up to? So this throws everything open. And let's be blunt here. The idea that lay people only have their fulfillment in the church if they take on roles that cardinals, bishops, and priests are doing, this is a vision of Christianity that I find completely skewed. Jesus didn't name everyone an apostle. Did he do something wrong? Of course not. The sheep are the reason the apostles exist. So the apostles take care of the sheep. Now to say, because there are no second-class citizens, women and lay people have to potentially vote in a conclave the way they vote in a synod, this is skewed. I'd be interested how you react to that.
Yeah, I have a similar reaction because the what we've seen so far in the synodal process is not encouraging. It seems to me that it's an attempt to be evangelistic and to get by uh, what some perceive to be bureaucratic structures. I think in some ways the Pope feels that the structures of the church itself are impeding what he regards as an evangelical impulse. I think he even thinks that certain forms of theology are impeding that. And I think you're absolutely right about the impact that this would have not only inside the church, but outside the church. Because as we saw at Vatican II, lots of things that people claim happened at Vatican II never actually happened. In fact, we still have the Vatican itself claiming that what Paul VI envisioned in creating the Synod of Bishops is what we have, in this new thing with other people being included. That's not true. We also know that in Vatican II, there was a distinct separation between the shepherds and lay people. Lay people were supposed to not come into the inside of the church to govern. They were supposed to go out into the world and evangelize in the workplace, in their recreations, in their friendships. And instead, what we're getting is, in this attempt to go outward, we're actually bringing people facing inward. So I think it's going to have, if it does happen, it's going to have a paradoxical effect to the one that people intend. And the thing that most of all might be the most radical shift of all is people are not going to regard the Pope in the same way. I think he's going to now look like an elected official, like a prime minister a president or a senator. And is that really the fundamental vision of the pontifex, the bridge builder, the person who's supposed to bring all the sheep together in the church under Jesus Christ? It just seems to me that politicizing is almost inevitable if we start to get the change in the format of how the Pope is going to be elected. Father, we have to leave it here. We like to keep these podcasts brief. Thank you for your time as usual and your brilliance in cutting into these matters. No doubt we're going to be back before long. I hoped we weren't going to be back this week, but who knows, we may be back next week, depending on what's happening. It seems like Rome certainly had all this stuff prepared to come out right after the Synod. It was time to come right out that first week. And so I think we're likely to see much more, especially in these first couple of months, as the next synod is being shaped, and there's going to be influences on where your parish is and your diocese, and there's going to be influence going back to Rome from those lower level organizations. So thanks, Father. Thanks everybody for watching and for listening, and we'll see you again very soon.